Welcome to Regenerative Rising Podcast, Elevating Stories, Activating Change. I'm your guest host, Elizabeth Candelario. This is the fourth podcast that I've done for Regenerative Rising. And I have to say that one of the joys of hosting these discussions is introducing people to you that have been a big influence in my life and my thinking about regenerative agriculture and climate change. Thiele is one of those people. Michael is the executive director of Apis Arborea, and his mission is to get us to rethink how we think about and support Apis Millifera, the honeybee. I've known Michael for more than 15 years. I've called on his expertise many times. And whenever I listen to Michael, not only does my knowledge grow, but my heart does too. Michael has presented his work at Harvard University and other educational organizations. He's consulted for the USDA, and he's spoken at conferences around the world. In fact, Michael's nickname to me is the Bee Whisperer. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you for having me, Elizabeth. Wonderful to be here.
And you're checking in from Sebastopol, California, right?
Yes, I am.
And I'm here talking to you from London, where it is snowing today, which is very unusual and quite beautiful, actually. So thank you for joining us today, Michael. Before we start our conversation, I want to admit to a blind spot that I've had, and I think that many of us in agriculture and climate change have, around honeybees. I'll illustrate that point by speaking to the following. In 2017, the USDA strengthened their requirements regarding organic livestock to ensure production practices that support their well-being and natural behavior. The Regenerative Organic Certification Standard, which in part builds on the animal welfare standards of the NOP, speaks about the 5 freedoms. One of those freedoms is the ability for animals to express behaviors natural to their species. The Demeter Biodynamic Standard says that an animal's care and welfare must be given extensive consideration. For example, their housing must be designed in a way that allows animals to freely express their innate nature. Yet, when it comes to honeybees, we don't think about them in the same way. In the context of biodiversity, we think about supporting bees by focusing on land use and forage, by ensuring that the land is managed in a certain way, that there's a diversity of plants for their food. But what about their housing? I'd like to ask our listeners, when you think about a honeybee's home, what comes to mind for you? The work of Apis Arborea is centered on creating habitat by placing log hives high up in the trees. Their design is meant to reflect bees' instinctive preferences, to be in support of bees' ability to express their innate nature. In order for you to visualize what Michael and I will be discussing, I wanted to play a portion of a documentary short, Rewilding Honeybees, that filmmaker Cameron Nielsen did about Michael's work. We'll just show a 1-minute clip out of the 9-minute short, but at the end of our discussion today, if you want to hang on, and I really recommend that you do, the entire short will be available to view. Cameron's film has been showcased at a lot of film festivals. It won Best Documentary Short at the Sonoma International Film Festival and was a finalist at TVE's Global Sustainability Awards, but it hasn't been released to the public yet. So I'm super thrilled to be showing it with you today and very grateful to Cameron for allowing us to watch it together. Rewilding Honeybees.
I remember when I set up my first log hive. A swarm had moved in, and I could open one end cap to view the bees inside. And I remember to this day, when I looked inside, it felt like the first human being stepping onto the moon, meaning it was nothing I'd ever seen before. It began with the formation of bees long before the first comb was visible. In how bees were as a being, the shape, the movement, the intricate layers. Nothing by chance, everything on purpose, everything had meaning. And I had no idea what that meaning was. I realized that I didn't know anything about bees.
Mikhail, what did you mean when you said, I didn't know anything about bees?
Yeah, it was for me a really a pivotal moment in my life when I ended up, for some reason, stepping into it seemed like a completely new world. And I had started my life with bees within the conventional paradigm of framed hive environments and such. And then this next step just opened up. And the moment I opened a log hive, which is mimicking natural conditions, nest site conditions, I opened it up and I had never seen bees in that shape, in that form. It was the way it smelled, the way the sound, the biophony of this animal seemed completely different. And I felt, and I said it, I think in the film, I felt like Armstrong stepping onto the moon. It was this watershed moment. And realizing how different it felt and that I couldn't place things. I was overwhelmed with this completely new experience. And that made me realize that there were so many limitations in my knowledge of who bees are, what they need, and how I could care for them in the best possible way. And so it was stepping into territory which was unknown, and I didn't have any new reference frames. And so it literally felt like I don't know anything about bees. Of course, it didn't mean that I don't know anything about bees. And yet, when I said I don't know anything about bees, it means that I could perceive a whole new field which I was not familiar with, and which also seemed so primordial, so indigenous, and had this shocking quality too. This realization, whoops, I have not been aware of some of the utmost fundamentals of this animal.
So Mika, let's back up a little bit and talk about maybe people that are listening, not everybody's had an experience of seeing a Langstrom hive, the typical white boxes that you see on farms and in landscape. Can you kind of talk about the design of those and how that came about, and then take us from that design into what you're trying to accomplish with the rewilding concept?
Okay. If I may, let's go back in time a little bit further. So this Langstrom hive, the creation and introduction of this new paradigm of adding four-sided frames into the nest environment of this being, that was brand new. That was cutting edge around 1850. Before that point, there has been a thousands of year long tradition of apiculture, which was much closer to the natural nesting condition of honeybees. And you can see it in traditional, historic pictures and images where bees were, for the longest time, really kept in living trees even, and then in big trunks. which tree trunks, which mimicked that indigenous nesting ecosystem. So then in the 1850s, at the peak of the Industrial Revolution, many things shifted. And the mindset had already shifted with Descartes, which the loss of enchantment and the belief that life is quite mechanic and can be explained within mechanics. This atomistic worldview just took hold more and more. And that also then was applied to the world of honeybees. And here, all of a sudden, the mechanics of thinking, of designing, made their way into that realm, and in the form of thin-walled hives, very practical. All parts are all of a sudden interchangeable, extremely convenient to a certain kind of mindset of that time, and all the way up to today. What's interesting, Elizabeth, is that right in the 1850s, and at the time of the introduction of this new system, some of the older beekeepers, those who had practiced beekeeping or apiculture, I like to call it, for decades, learning it from their forebears, from their ancestors, they still had this intimacy with this being. They still knew what it needed, and they knew who they really were and how to care for them. And they became witnesses of the shift. And all of a sudden, for example, diseases emerged, diseases which had not been yet any issue. And nowadays, they are being called foul brood, diseases of the brood, where in the 1850s, those old guys, they didn't call it that, they called it the beekeeper's disease, because they still had the clarity of past tradition, which enabled them to see the true causes of emerging problems. And therefore, it was clear to them it was the new design, the modern design, and with it coming the modern practices and management techniques. And I find it really powerful to think back at that time when there was still contrast because the new system was new, and the old folks could see what happened to the health and resilience of this animal and how it was degrading. So, however, from there, this system took off. It became, by the early 20th century, probably the main hive design system. And that is true all the way up to today.
It's just so interesting how the conventionalization of bees so mirrors the industrialization, I should say, of agriculture. And the same was being said for livestock, where they brought them indoors, they kept them in these conditions of extremely restricted mobility, they introduced antibiotics and all of these other things that because the animal's health was so impacted. It's remarkable to me, the parallels between the evolution of how we've looked at livestock and bees, and yet now we're at a point where we're evolving further in our understanding of livestock, and yet we haven't done that with bees. So take me into today and Apis Arborea work around the concept of rewilding. Can you give our listeners kind of an overview of what that means?
Sure. I think, first of all, I would say that it seems obvious that in many areas, not only within apiculture, we really passed a peaking of validity of this mechanical system, and we are now on the other side. We now live in a time where we question that which was still recently considered the foundation of human life on Earth. But now a lot of things show us very clearly that the shortcomings of those belief systems. And therefore, within apiculture, the same thing is happening. I would say Apis arborea is just part of this larger shift on Earth in regards to honeybees. And I would say that we live in a time where we are facing an opportunity to reconsider the categories of this world as we made them. And we find ourselves learning about complexities. And rewilding, I would say, means to subscribe to a system-based approach. And within that, there are many different levels we can follow. But rewilding as a term is, in the context of honeybees, it's not defined by the geohistorical distribution of the species in different kind of areas of the world, but it is rather a notion and a tool to rehabilitate indigenous apian wisdom, to return birthrights, to grant indigenous birthrights of this animal. So we are talking now about ethics, right? On a foundational level. And this is one portion of rewilding, and that is to acknowledge, and that is now has to do with to reconsider the categories of the world, right? So here now we want to reintroduce dignity and agency and sentience to the world of animal stewardship. And in order to take that on as a task, now we need to know, well, who is this being? What does it need? And how can I help and be a good steward in working with, we could call it biomimicry, right? I need to learn and mirror those conditions. And that is another aspect of rewilding, which is to identify those, let's call them natural nesting parameters, and then to see how can we translate that into design and further programming, in which then it spills into conservation. Because we have to acknowledge that in the US, 44% of all 2.8 million commercial hives die every year. That's over 1 million. And that's the commercial, I like to refer to it as a cosmology. That's the commercial cosmology, similar to, I would say, a concentrated animal feedlot operation. And then on the other side, we have this wild honeybee cosmology. Wild Apis Millifera living in remote areas, landscapes, and not facing those issues at all. They are very successful self-sustaining populations in the wild. And we have a chance, a tremendous opportunity here to learn, to go back to those wild conditions and learn and to see what makes this ecology of selves so successful, and then how can we translate it into...
It's great, Mikhail, because you're asking the same question that the NOP asked, that the Regenerative Organic Alliance is asking, that the Demeter Standard has asked, and that is, what is the innate nature of this animal? How does it want to express itself? And therefore, how can we create an environment that will allow for that? I think that's just really beautiful. So from a practical standpoint, then, you have these log hives that you create and you put them in the trees. Can you give us a little bit more just information about how you go about designing these log hives, where you place them in the landscape, and how you determine where they go and how many are needed and those kinds of things?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, in terms of design, like I alluded to earlier, we need to be aware of instinctual preferences. What do they like? What do they need? Not only like, but need for survival, that they can thrive, and which also provides them with the right conditions for emotional well-being. And so I can share a few. The first one is, Elizabeth, you mentioned, they're all set up in the trees and not anymore close onto ground level. Like that's where we typically would find those square boxes. Well, honeybees really like living far above ground level. And when we look at studies which have been done in the last decades of honeybees in the wild, it shows very clearly that they love height. I've seen wild nests in eucalyptus trees literally 50 feet above ground level. And that is one. That is why we want to match that. We want to match that preference, and therefore the log hives will go into trees or maybe onto barn walls or something like that, and typically between 15 and 20 feet above ground level. Next one is a big one, and that is the log hives provide warmth and insulation. The typical conventional hive is very thin walled, 3/4 of an inch walls. And now one has to know that honeybees are actually a warm-blooded and mammalian-like being. And it's very susceptible to heat and cold. By the natural tree nest parameters provide this animal with thick walls, and there's like inches and inches, maybe sometimes a foot of wall space, which then in turn can serve as a warmth bank, because the wood warms up, and it's a buffer, and it comes with many other functions. And therefore the log hives are very thick walled, between 4 and 5 inches of wall thickness. Another portion, design feature, has to do with volume. There have been a lot of studies done. We have a lot of data which shows that the natural nest size is, let's call it, around 40 liters or 10 gallons. But since the introduction of the modern hive system, that has been thrown out of the window and quadrupled by default. And now we have data which shows very clearly what the impacts are on health and survival and resilience and all those things. So to make that story very short, we'll just match that natural nest volume of 40 liters. Another thing, maybe one more thing, which has to do with nest density. You mentioned, Elizabeth, you mentioned, how many do you put up and how do you know all of that? So it's called nest density, and it shows how closely bees really live to each other. And it turns out that depending on, of course, climate zones and other, what kind of ecosystem are you in, it can vary, but on average, we can find about 1 nest per square kilometer, or 2.5 per square mile. And then just compare that for a second to our default, where we have easily 4 hives sitting next on the same bench, or go commercial, and now we're talking about 500 in the same apiary. And again, Elizabeth, which is mind-boggling, there have been all those studies out, and the authors of the entomologists who study this, the authors of the studies, they say, well, this is how they do it in the wild, and that is why they're so healthy. But unfortunately, that paradigm cannot be translated into commercial applications. It's not applicable. It wouldn't work with a commercial spiel. And I find it just shocking, because we know better, but the conditions within the commercial cosmology seem to not be able to give or change or adapt. There's pressure, whatever it may be, economical, whatever it is. But we know already. And now we live in this extremely creative time where we have an opportunity to see, well, how can we change? How can we change and integrate those new principles? Because there's so much at stake. There's actually life is at stake. And that really is our core element for Apis arborea, is always to reconnect to the source. And the wild populations are the source and are also the hope. And it's such a dynamic setup, which is constituted by so many different elements, that it's a rich matrix for us to learn, not only in the apicultural or agricultural area, but I believe also in the socio-economical and cultural domain, because bees have this unique quality of being with each other and of being in the world that matches so beautifully, like regenerative advantages and perspectives. So from this core area of wild populations, then we try to develop different programs for semi-managed landscapes, for urban, for agricultural ecosystems, and they each have different demands because the conditions are different. And I would even go so far and say we would love to work with the commercial realm if that's possible at this time. But it's a full range, and each area demands a different programming almost.
I see. Let's unpack a little bit more the world of commercial beekeeping. And you quoted a statistic. I have some here. Honeybees provide 50% of crop pollination services. They're responsible for 1 in every 3 bites of food Americans consume. They contribute $15 billion annually to the value of the nation's crop production. The growing interdependence between the nation's food security and managed pollinators comes amid a double-digit decline in honeybee populations. Commercial beekeepers lost 44% of their colonies from April 2019 to this past April, with reductions in the summer of 2019, the highest ever recorded. What's happening here?
Do you expect an answer to that question?
I do. I want you to talk about that.
I think I see it as it's a system which has been running for quite some time, and the initially maybe subtle repercussions, a lot of impact, and the effects of that have been in the dark and not so visible, not so prominent, but it has been building. It has been building within many different biological systems within the web of life. Look at, probably we could say, with the rise of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, with it is mirrored in the conditions in the biosphere. We don't even know what's all happening in the biome of the earth, and but we are now at a place in time where we talk about tipping points and the concern for cascading effects, where the foundation of life is affected in such a way that there are moments where it just takes this one last famous drop, and it begins to cascade. And with honeybees, I do wonder where we are on that trajectory. How far away are we? And I'm sure you can find people who would just shake their heads and think this is stupid because we're all good. And there are numbers which show that currently there are more hives being used in the commercial realm here in the US than some time back. But those are numbers of hives. They don't say anything about health, So I think that's a large gesture building through the 20th century. And there have been people, philosophers and innovators like Rudolf Steiner, who was someone in Europe who gave lectures on bees in the 1920s. And he said, asked about those modern practices about beekeeping, he said, well, let's talk again in 80 years and we will see that we will find a diminished resilience and health in honeybees because of those practices. It will show much later than, And I think to some extent it's true. It has been, and from there we can go many other places, just the way we see ourselves as individuals on this green planet. And who are we? What is our relationship? Do we belong? And if so, how do we belong? Are we truly independent, or are we actually co-constituted by all living beings? And that the loss of one bacteria is a partial or a micro death of our own. And you mentioned the numbers, Elizabeth, this unimaginable numbers of loss of species. And it makes me wonder, when will we wake up? When we will truly understand what is at stake? And that then in turn can also be this amazing opportunity for change and creativity, to reinvent the categories of the world, and to allow them to become more rich again, because I think because they were so impoverished by not seeing agency in living beings, in livestock and trees, in all life, and being lost to this belief that it's just a commodity, something which is not equal with us when it comes to those values. I don't know whether I answered your question, but that comes up.
Let's talk about science for a minute. So I'm thinking about all of the systematic faults that have come to light through our experience in the pandemic. And it's certainly something that we see a lot and talk a lot about in agriculture and food and climate. And when we think about bees in the little white boxes, a lot of the science is kind of tinkering with that within the context of the system, that clearly the whole system is broken. And I want to read a quote, and I'm so sorry, I don't know, I can't attribute it, because when I was making my notes in my research, I didn't write down who said this, and I apologize profusely for that. But this is the quote. One could make the case and say that studying honeybees in conventional hive systems is equivalent to studying tigers in the zoo. Not only will the artificial and unnatural environment distort the life gestures of the animal, but it also carries the danger of making an artificial environment into a foundational reference frame for stewardship and research. Can you comment on that and talk a little bit about the science, both on the conventional side and then moving more into this natural hive situation?
Mm-hmm. Sure. By the way, that is a quote from an article I wrote last year.
Oh, I should attribute that quote to you. Oh, perfect. Mikhail, thank you for clarifying for me.
So, yeah, what that points to is really, it's a fascinating story. conventional science, like you just said, researched honeybees, and in this artificial contraption for over a century. And that's why, and there are others who said it's the equivalent of studying tigers or another animal in the zoo. You study this in a completely artificial context, and this will not be a successful attempt at finding out who that life form really is and everything related. So that is, and I have to say, still up to this day, that's the default. However, around the 1970s, that started very slowly to shift. And there's one particular researcher from Cornell, Professor Thomas Thiele, who then went back to the forest to study honeybees. And I'm so grateful. We all are very grateful that someone finally left the zoo to look for tigers in the wild, and that generated for the first time in modern times data about the natural conditions of honeybees and what they need, how they organize, what works, what are their preferences. And that was the beginning of, it was, I think initially, definitely a research on the fringes, something very unusual. But now the world is transformed out of so many reasons, one of which is the mainstream, the conventional beekeeping paradigm wants to know what's the secret behind this success story out there in the wild, in the forests. And there's now some money coming, and it's a tremendous struggle within the conventional paradigm to find a path through this very challenging territory or terrain. We have introduced pests like the varroa mite, and people want to find out how to find a new way of dealing with this very difficult situation. And yeah, varroa is such and maybe we should let's use varroa just as an example of those two different cosmologies, right? It's a little ectoparasite which had lived in a symbiosis with the Asian honeybee, Apis cerana. And with global trading, how it just happens, it ended up in the Western Hemisphere. And that was in the 1980s. And so initial host parasite contact is devastating. Two systems meet for the first time, and it's a little bit like coronavirus and human beings. Anyway, so those two meet. It's initially really devastating, and they have to figure out the system to coexist, basically. And there's lots of research done how you can project it out, and eventually it leads to, I would call it a symbiotic relationship. So the varroa meets the commercial realm first, and because of migratory beekeeping, within a year, I think it's all over the US. It's insane how hives are being trucked all over. And we have to remember, it's a being which is not mobile. It just lives in a tree. And trees don't have feet, as far as I know. So anyway, the varroa enters the commercial context. It's devastating. People are struggling. They don't know what to do. But also the wild populations are affected by varroa, and they struggle. They go through a huge process with varroa. And because no one is doing anything about it in the wild, this naturally occurring process can unfold, And all of a sudden, on the other end, bees and varroa come out, and in a way that allows them to live with each other without high mortality rates for honeybees. And now, when we go into the wild, we find a lot of nests, apian nests with varroa. They all have varroa, but they're not dying because of varroa. So on the commercial side, in beekeeping, that process was never supported, but rather that up to this very moment, as we talk to each other here, is varroa is considered a pest. It has to be targeted in many different ways. And as long as we target that varroa mite, we arrest this potential from them working this out, rebalancing that relationship. And as long as we don't empower that natural process, we are caught in this almost self-fulfilling prophecy of it will never end. We will have to treat, and that's what people say, we have to treat till the end of our life because there's nothing. And then, you know, people throw pesticides. Imagine people introduce pesticides, all kinds, into the hive. Yeah. And they accumulate in the wax. They make it, of course, into honey, into pollen. So, and then, like I mentioned earlier, Elizabeth, now the entomologists, they go into the forest and they have very clear data. They say, look, this system is good to go. They went through that bottleneck and came out resilient the other way. And we can do it in our apiaries, but it's not non-compatible with our system. So, sorry. And it's so. However, the good, and then maybe one more thing, the good thing for our movement, for this pioneering movement of arboreal apiculture is we have so much data. We have so much data which can document life and resilience of wild populations of honeybees. And it's a powerful foundation and a wonderful resource.
Let me ask you about your work with land-based conservation organizations, which when I was learning about this, Mika, I would be like, yeah, of course. I mean, they have conservation strategies. They should be thinking about the health and welfare of pollinators in general, and certainly honeybees. And yet you almost showed up as disruptive to some of the thinking within that context. There's some controversy about encouraging honeybee habitat in land that's under conservation management. What is that about? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, thank you for asking. It's such a beautiful area to discuss. It's very complex as well. And yes, it is disruptive, what we're suggesting or pointing to. I want to start out by trying to find a position, a role of Apis mellifera in the Americas. And that is, and in order to do so, I have to do something else. I would like to look at, I want to put our attention at how landscapes are always cultural and one cannot separate one from the other. And I'm saying it because from the numbers may not be correct, but roughly to give you an idea, from all the 5,000 different species within the US realm, I heard something like 3,000 have been introduced, including Caucasians people. And honeybees have been living in the Americas since the 15th century.
when the Pilgrims basically brought the honeybees with them to the U.S.,
Yeah,
people listening might not even realize that the honeybees are not native to the U.S.
exactly. Yeah, they arrived at Hispaniola in the 15th century and continued their journey to the entire continent, South and North America. I now consider honeybees as an endemic wild species, and that's one cosmology. The other is the cosmology of conventional beekeeping, and they seem to be very different worlds. Now, within conservation organizations, one of their goals is to protect native species, so-called native species, but also non-Apis pollinators, and that's solitary and semi-social bees of all kinds. And now here's a very interesting connection, Elizabeth. In order to protect those solitary bees and semi-social bees, there's a concern within the conservation community about a possible impact from honeybees on those pollinator communities. And there are so many studies looking at exactly that, where they researched the impact of, and this is now an important distinction, the impact of managed honeybees on those pollinator communities. And there's an unbelievable number of studies out there, and you can go through them, and they all come to the result that managed honeybees have often a negative impact on those non-Apis pollinator communities. And that has become a credo or a belief system for many people in the conservation field. And what is missing, and that's what Apis arborea is trying to do, what is missing is an awareness for this other cosmology of wild Apis mellifera. And I want to compare this for a moment. We have managed honeybees on one side, where we have nest densities of, there are 300, 400, 1,000 hives parked. And so the density there is up to 1,400% above normal. Do you remember the numbers before I mentioned? Normal in the wild is to have 2.5 nests per square mile. And one can basically say we have no data. We have no research paper which look at how endemic wild honeybees actually co-constitute wild pollinator communities as an equal part, as a partner, and not as a threat. So, and it's clear that just the densities of conventional beekeeping has an impact on everything. Yeah, and we don't have to go into the detail how it turns out to be and what it exactly is, but it's a completely different paradigm we talk about. So Apis arborea we have no connections really with beekeeping even. What we focus on is wild endemic Apis mellifera, honeybees living in the wild. And a lot of ecological preserves, all of them, we can assume, host wild honeybees today, now. So we are not suggesting to introduce anyone. What we are trying to do is to assess do they have what they need? And if not, what can we do to help them to live their own life in a supported way, which does not have an impact on other so-called native pollinators? This dichotomy, native versus alien, is really a 20th century belief system. We talk about neo-natives. We talk about climate-induced migration of all species. It is not black and white. So that is maybe my attempt to to answer your question, because it's so rich and complex and very rewarding. We are currently working with an organization here in Sonoma County, and we started this work, and now we actually are joining forces to add to our rewilding programs some surveying of populations in the field. And we work with a local university here, which is really exciting. Everybody seems to be inspired, I hope.
Systems thinking is getting a lot of attention these days, as it should be, in finance, in food, in government, within organizations and companies. Watching those bees interact within the context of the log hive seems to be the ultimate example of nature's expression of systems. What can bees teach us about how we think about and design systems?
Yeah, this is a beautiful question. The log hive environment, what it really tries to do is to mimic a natural environment. And in doing so, we will be able to witness the fullest and the most natural expression of who this apian being is. And we can witness their matrix of how they're organized on all kinds of levels. And it gets interesting pretty quickly, because first of all, we could say that they teach us that it is impossible to isolate a problem without having awareness of the broader context. In other words, the moment we touch one nest, we actually touch 8,000 acres surrounding that place, that location, because that is what honeybees do. They forage on the surrounding 8,000 acres. And everything within that ecosystem is being reflected in the health and resilience of this one animal. Another interesting aspect within honeybees is that they, as a system, they appear to be made of thousands, tens of thousands of individuals. And yet, when we look closer, we will realize that there is something about what we could call a singularity of a being. It's actually only one being. And the way, so in other words, the individuals, their sense of self is such that it includes everything surrounding them. You will not, I promise you, you will not find a single bee in the hive which has stashed away a little piece of comb and honey and pollen and say, this is mine, you better don't touch this. Because they live outside the concept of ownership. It's not in their vocabulary. It is about common ground. And as a system, it seems impossible to them to do what human beings are doing, to fracture, where here it is always happening as I like to refer to as a tissue-like gathering of individuals. And then we can look at the ways decisions are made. And it is never in a way where one of them say, I'm right, my way is the way. But it is always collaborative, because survival depends on mutually arriving at consensus. It's consensus based. So it seems, another interesting aspect of honeybees is that it seems they integrate that what seems foreign to them into their own body almost. They only can survive because they integrate what we refer to as pests into their own being, like a wax moth, for example. The wax moth is a completely different species, but it can only live within the nest of honeybees. And so it's not a pest, but it's almost like an external organ function, which comes in the form of a different species into this apian matrix. And in system-based designing, I think we have to be open for surprises. And also, I would make the case that there is enough evidence to, when we approach an issue on a system-based level, to always leave an area for that what we don't know, because there's always more co-constituting what we are working with than we can even imagine. So there's the invisible realm too.
Okay.
Maybe a little bit, that's my brambling answer to your question.
Fantastic. We could do a whole podcast just on looking at the organization of the bees and what that teaches us about systems thinking. Maybe we'll do that. Okay, so this is my last question for you.
Okay.
I know that you are a practicing Buddhist. I guess I would say that I'm an aspirational Buddhist. Is your approach to bees informed by your Buddhist practice? What do bees teach you on a personal level?
Well, if you tell a Buddhist that he or she is a Buddhist, that's always a problematic statement. But anyway, I'm aspiring just with you together, with all of us. You know what's interesting is that while I lived, I was in residential practice at a Buddhist Zen temple for quite some time. And that's where my journey with bees began, on temple grounds. And I just realized later that bees had been our ally throughout space and time, really. And when we look at, let's say, monastic rules, we'll find that they all almost try to mirror some of the values within the apian life, and that of altruism and compassion, and most of all, I would say, service. And we talked about selflessness just a moment ago. That is really there, and this deep understanding of what Thich Nhat Hanh in the Vietnamese tradition so beautifully called interbeing, that we are all participating in interbeing. And we struggle because it often looks as not as interbeing. It looks like here's me and there's the rest of the cosmos. And so I find For me personally, honeybees are really an inspiration of the heart. They are an inspiration for a lot of personal inquiry into who am I, why am I here. They're also an inspiration to be humble and to think of others as myself, just as bees do. And I think also we can say that it's not limited to Buddhist practice, but I would say all different faiths have that in common, and those values in common, and that striving, and bees seem to not only mirror that striving, but it's as if they realize to some extent what we are still striving for. And some people say, oh yeah, bees are very evolved when it comes to consciousness and wisdom. And one more reason to pay attention to their gestures and what they do and how they talk to us. And Elizabeth, what I find so interesting is you say honeybee, and everybody's like, oh yeah, but we have such an affinity with bees. It's very different when you say goldfish. It's like, yeah, it's cute, but is it as equally heartwarming? And I'm not saying for some people it may, but there is a difference. There is something within the life of bees which is so appealing, and it's palpable through the heart. It's not a cognitive thing, it's to the heart. And you almost cannot help yourself but not be touched by them. It's a very strong, it's very medicinal, I would say.
Mikhail, thank you so much for your time talking with us today. I want to encourage everybody who's listening to go to Mikhail's website. It's apisarborea.com. He also has a lot of fascinating videos on YouTube that you can explore as well. And as I mentioned earlier, we are now going to play in its entirety this 9-minute documentary short, Rewilding Honeybees by Cameron Nielsen. Cameron is dedicated to visual storytelling that illustrates solutions to complex issues of our times. This film, Rewilding Honeybees, as I mentioned, won Best Documentary Short at Sonoma International Film Festival and was a finalist at the TVE Global Sustainability Awards. I want to thank Cameron again for allowing us to share this with you now. And Mikhail, thank you so much for your time. That was a beautiful conversation.
It was my pleasure, Elizabeth. Thank you so much.
I started dreaming about bees. Dreams came to me, and I had so many dreams about bees. And that was the beginning of my life with bees. Oh. The amazing thing is that there is oneness in multitude. We have to look through the multitude to fully see the oneness. I remember when I set up my first log hive, a swarm had moved in, and I could open one end cap to view the bees inside. And I remember to this day, when I looked inside, it felt like the first human being stepping onto the moon, meaning it was nothing I'd ever seen before. It began with the formation of bees long before the first comb was visible. In how bees were as a being, the shape, the movement, the intricate layers. Nothing by chance, everything on purpose, everything had meaning. And I had no idea what that meaning was. I realized that I didn't know anything about bees.
Honeybees provide 50% of crop pollination services. In other words, if humans want to have agriculture and food, our fate is tied in with that one species. It's not unusual for beekeepers with their managed colonies to lose 40 or 50% of the colonies every year. And that's not what we're seeing happening in the wild. Having the bees in the wild is a genetic resource for us. These bees that we keep in our boxes are still basically wild animals. They don't need to live in our boxes. They can live completely on their own.
Rewilding honeybees means to reconnect to instinctual preferences of honeybees. We can mirror that in design and management. It starts with research in what conditions will be conducive to longevity.
There's several reasons why colonies in the wild are having a higher survival rate than colonies living in beekeepers' hives. Part of it is better genetics in the wild thanks to the filtering of natural selection. But the other side is lifestyle, and there's a lot about the way bees live in the wild that is healthier for them. The bees are pretty choosy about where they nest. You might be surprised because what they are seeking in their homes are features that are quite different from what we provide them with in hives. They like to live high up in trees. Almost none where the entrance is below about 15 feet up. That's like the minimum. Whereas the beekeeper's colonies are right at ground level, so the beekeeper can work them. Another big difference is the size of the home that the bees live in. A beekeeper's hive is 2 or 3 times larger than what the bees are using as a home site or nest cavity in the wild. The bees also like the entrance small, about 1.5 square inches. There's an immense difference between the spacing of the nests of colonies living in the wild versus in a beekeeper's bee yard. The consequences of that are there's much more mixing of bees, and that means if one colony has a high load of parasites, some of those parasites can be carried by the workers into neighboring colonies. We just don't see that going on in the wild.
The Langstrom hive was invented in the late 19th century. At the peak of the Industrial Revolution, the steam engine came, cars came soon later, and the world had become a machine. And it culminated in the Langstrom hive. The nest, which had been round, becomes rectangular, it becomes a box, thin-walled, with straight frames, which force this being to abandon its natural ways. This way of beekeeping maneuvers outside of contemporary scientific research. 160 hives were set up here in an environment which doesn't support so many bees in terms of forage and food. They add cans on top, which force feeds bees a mixture of high fructose corn syrup, antibiotics, other pesticides. Those hives are so thin-walled, they're just trying to stay alive. But this is normal. It turns my inside over. There is no state or federal regulation to protect nor to grant them any basic rights. It's about making money and keeping this asset alive as if it's just a Wall Street operation. This shows us the consequences of that kind of commodity-driven thinking. Where are ethics and moral? Where is the respect for life? That we all belong to each other. that the way we treat this life form represents the way we treat ourselves. It really is such a motivator for a radical shift. We have to really wake up to who this animal is. We have to wake up to what it needs so we can really become stewards. What rewilding does is it puts the way we think about bees upside down, which means the right side up. And with this shift, our role as human beings shifts too. We are so used to thinking in terms of apiaries, having lots of hives in one spot and having to manage bees. What rewilding does is it allows the watershed to become the apiary. We foster and create the dynamic environment which is then self-sustaining, and we find creative ways to link to it. Log hives, due to their natural nest volume, will swarm more frequently and generate locally adapted bees. And those swarms then can be integrated into our hives. It is clear our conventional ways of being on this planet, they are not really sustainable. We have to reconnect with a deeper and broader wisdom and knowledge. And that's what rewilding does. Rewilding is taking into consideration the biotic web of life at a time of crisis, in a time which asks for bold moves, because we're running out of time. It's time now for us to move and to try something different.